Okay, folks, it's time to get this show on the road. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Judy Flagg. I'm the historian for the town of Salem. This evening's presentation is a collaborative effort between the Bancroft Public Library, the historic Salem Courthouse, the Fort Salem Theater, and the Town of Salem Historian's Office. A few weeks ago, we were trying to find a way to bring awareness to Fort Salem Theater's upcoming production of The Diary of Anne Frank, which will be starting next week. And we were trying to find a speaker who could come and really bring awareness to that time, that terrible time in history, and to also be lead-in to The Diary of Anne Frank. Janice asked me if I knew of anybody who could speak to that. And of course, the first person who came to mind for me was Matthew Rozell. Matthew has been an educator for over 30 years, and he's written over 8 books on the subject of the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the victims of the concentration camps, and the American soldier Liberators who went in at the end of the war and were able to save some of those people. He is here tonight to bring awareness to all of us about that time in history. And also, we think about the many lives he has touched over the years in his teaching at Hudson Falls, where he was a teacher for over 30 years, and how those students' lives were touched by the way he was making history come alive for them through the interviews of the veterans of World War II, and all of the reminiscences and stories that they could tell. And I'm sure he touched hundreds of lives with those stories. And I'm predicting that you here in this room tonight will take away stories and memories that will last with you for the rest of your life. Will you help me in welcoming Matthew Rozell?
Thank you, Judy. Can you all hear me? Okay. Judy, that was the first time I got introduced without somebody looking at note cards. You did a great job. My name is Matthew Rozell, and I'm here tonight to promote The Diary of Anne Frank, the play that's going to go on next week. I have some information about Anne Frank that you probably may not have ever heard before. And it has to do with my own awakening as a history teacher in Hudson Falls, New York. I created this PowerPoint. I've used it a few times, but I tried to tailor it more to this audience tonight. So I'll start by saying, I'm Matthew Rozell. And here's some more about me. Oh. Something amazing happened to me a few years ago. It was only 2 years ago. Well, with this pandemic, it seems like forever, right? But in late August of 2019, my brother-in-law, who is a great man, he's a couple years older than me, he's about ready to spend some of his money on artwork and travel in Europe and stuff. So he took his sister, my wife, Laura, who is a school teacher like me. She retired about a year before I did. She actually was substitute teaching today. She has to go back in tomorrow. That's why she's not here tonight. Usually she helps me sell the books afterwards. But the story is we were going to Sicily to see a concert and over to Naples. But Brian, the brother, wanted to make a stop in Amsterdam. He wanted to see the Rembrandt exhibit, and he wanted to see the Van Gogh exhibit at the Rijksmuseum. So we were there for 2 nights, and one night I walked out of the hotel, and I took a stroll, and I found myself in front of the Anne Frank house. It was about 11 o'clock at night. And this is kind of a whirlwind trip, right? And I learned about Anne Frank. I've studied her. I've learned a lot about her from my experiences with my own Holocaust survivor friends, etc. And I found myself outside of her door, next to a canal in Amsterdam. And of course, the museum is there, the Anne Frank House. We couldn't get tickets because you have to book a month in advance, but I just sat there and I thought, you see, the first time I ever set foot in Germany, it was to study the Holocaust. And I went with a dedicated group of teachers. This program was led by survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and it's only for teachers. It was a 3-week intensive trip. I'm going to show you some slides from that trip in this presentation. But the first place they took us, we flew into Frankfurt, and we went to the house where Anne Frank was born and grew up, before they had to flee to the Netherlands to Amsterdam. So, Anne Frank is a big part of the story tonight. Anyway, I was in Hudson Falls for over 30 years. This is my last class, in my classroom. I'm working on my 9th book now. It's all World War II oral history, which was the basis for a lot of my classroom teaching. In 2007, 2008, I was a United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Teacher Fellow, and they never let go of you. They heard about my work, they invited me to apply, and there's about 350, I think, maybe 400 now, of us in the country, but our job is to teach the Holocaust to other teachers. That's a pretty heavy responsibility. In 2010, I was awarded the Organization of American Historians Teacher of the Year. That was a pretty big deal. And I went on this trip in 2013 that changed my life. It was 3 weeks touring concentration camps with experts and survivors. It's pretty heavy. But you know what? There was 24 of us teachers. They put us up in 5-star hotels at the end of the day, in every city. It's pretty amazing. And New York State, our own state, gave me their highest award in 2016. I studied at Yad Vashem in Israel, in Jerusalem, again sitting at the feet of some of the world's foremost Holocaust historians, and it was 3 weeks in the summertime. It was hot. And again, they took us out and they made sure we saw the sights, because this was pretty heavy learning we were doing. And the Greater Glens Falls Jewish community named me a righteous human being in 2018. They somehow got through all the red tape, and this granite monument was installed in my own village park in Hudson Falls, with a beautiful maple tree growing behind it. And no, I'm not buried underneath the, because that's what students think, right? Anyway, how did I come to this long journey to be here at the Salem Courthouse tonight? When I started my career in Hudson Falls, it was the late 1980s, and this is a photograph from probably the mid-1990s, and of course that's me, the younger version, with 3 of my Pacific veterans. What I found out, I always had an interest in World War II, and people ask me, well, wow, my father was a Korean War vet. I did have an aunt who was a nurse in Italy. She's actually in volume 4 of my series, an interview with her. But I just was fascinated when I was just getting out of college in the mid-80s. You have to remember, it was 40 years anniversary after the end of World War II. And D-Day was the big marker watershed event that everybody was focusing on. So in 1984, in June, Ronald Reagan, the American president, went to Omaha Beach, the cliffs over Normandy, and there was a whole host of veterans from the United States, from Great Britain, I'm sure some German veterans, etc. And it was a huge deal. And I was kind of moved by that whole event, because this is one of the first times these veterans had gotten together after the war to talk amongst each other about what happened and why they were going back. And of course, they were accompanied by younger family members, sons, daughters, grandchildren, etc. And I was really knocked out by that. The other thing I was knocked out about was in 1984, a book came out. It was called The Good War by Spencer Kell. You may be familiar with him. He was an oral historian who interviewed the common, ordinary people. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's about 500 or 600 pages long, and I can remember reading it in my crappy apartment at my college town as I was studying to be a history teacher, and I was moved by it. So I did get a job in Hudson Falls, the town that I graduated from, the high school that I graduated from. Even though when I left town, when I graduated 7 years previous, I told my father I was leaving this crappy town, never coming home. Well, here I am on the other side of the desk. And I talk about that in my book, Train Near Magdeburg. Because there's no way a person like me should have been doing this history with these kids. I was really not interested in the kids. I was more interested in the history, right? But I guess my point is, I started to connect these World War II veterans with our young people, and it was a spark that took off. I would ask my kids, when we started to study World War II, because I had an interest in it. Do you know anybody who was in the Second World War? And of course, late 1980s, early 90s, not one hand, but every kid raised two hands, okay? Their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, and in many cases, their own parents were World War II veterans. So the wheels started to click in my head. I said, you know what? I'm going to make up this simple survey, and I'm going to send it home with the kids. I'm going to bribe them with extra credit. I didn't care. I'll give you 15 points on your next test if you get your grandfather to complete this and bring it in. Because I'm interested. I want to know what's out there. And in this 5-mile radius around Hudson Falls, going into Glens Falls, Fort Edward, etc., I got so much back. It stunned me. Okay? Like, here's my form, and the date was 98 for this guy. His present age is 75, okay? I started this a few years before. Some of these guys were in their 60s when they took these things. Job in the military. I was a surgical technician in the operating room at 100 General Hospital in France. Combat campaigns, Normandy to the Rhineland was combat scene. Combat was seen in our hospital was hit by German fighters, ME-109s, from Christmas Eve 1944 to through the month of January 1945. So this guy was in the Battle of the Bulge. What did it feel to know that you were part of a great historical effort? I'm glad that I was part of World War II. When the Jets bombed Pearl Harbor, everybody wanted to go. There wasn't too many left in Hudson Falls. We felt it was our duty to fight for our country. Here's a different person. It was a job to be done and we did it. Pretty common response, right? What experiences or advice can you share with the young people? Because that's the whole point of sending these surveys home, right? To help make the Second World War more relevant to them. War's not a gung-ho thing, war is hell. We lost almost half our company and we didn't see as much fighting as some other companies who lost most of their men there. One company ended up with 17 out of over 200 men. Okay, combat veteran, we must live in peace. Was combat scene, were you wounded? This one struck me. I went through the files the other night and I pulled these out. I haven't seen these in 20 or 25 years. Did not enter into combat due to death of 2 brothers. The law stated that as I received a letter from the Major General J. Julio, Washington, D.C. Now, we've seen these telegrams over and over again in veteran scrapbooks. announcing to the family that so-and-so is missing in action or killed in action, J. Julio, Adjutant General. So his parents must have got this letter. And the next sentence, please describe any memorable experience that are important to you. What was your situation like? An experience that I'll never forget came when I was notified by the Red Cross of the death of my two brothers. I was stationed at Hickman Field in Hawaii, which is Pearl Harbor. Okay, so you got that telegram. I think the new generation is in for hard times, too much alcohol and drug abuse. My prayers are for my grandchildren to get a good education and that they will never have to go to war. He felt, the grandkid wrote this, that he had a job to do, and he did it. He tries to forget it now. I like this one. Damn glad when it was over. This guy was awarded the Silver Star, and I never got the story behind it. And this one struck me the most, okay? Actually from the first guy, and it's written in an old man's hand, kind of shaky, but it's very powerful. I don't know how you could make the young people today understand what it was like to go through a nightmare like a World War II. And he's absolutely right. I was born 16 years after the war. What business do I have trying to tell my students what it was like? So I invited these veterans in, but I took this as a challenge. And that's why they started coming into the classroom. And for them, it was a catharsis, okay? They would literally pour out their souls. And I have theories about this. They didn't talk about it when they got home. That's just the way it was. It's like any veterans. They don't talk about that stuff unless somebody else who was with them or who had that experience could share in it with them. But the fact is, a lot of these veterans at that 40th anniversary, and then now the 50th anniversary, 1995, the end of World War II, Saving Private Ryan comes out, Schindler's List comes out, the Holocaust deniers come out of the woodwork, and these veterans are mad. And they say, how can we not tell our stories? And the bonds that they made with these young people was quite incredible. Because they began to send them out into the community and collect these stories. And that's why I'm here today. One of my students, his grandfather was a retired New York State Supreme Justice. His name was Carroll Red Walsh. He lived in Johnstown, that's where he was from, but he would come up to Hudson Falls for the summer with his wife Dorothy. And in this photograph, he's 80 years old. And you can see the little banner on the side. This is from the ABC World News Tonight. And I'll tell you how that. But I filmed him in his rocking chair, telling me a story that went back, at that time, over 50 years. This is in 2001, so I think it was like 56 years, right? He's talking about April 1945, a day called April 13th, actually. It was Friday the 13th. He had a friend, okay, so this is Red Walsh right here. That was his nickname, is Irish. Funny as heck. His buddy was George Gross. And these two guys, they actually landed in Normandy. They were the 743rd Tank Battalion, which was attached to the 30th Infantry Division. They started out in the 1st Army, they wound up in the 9th Army by the time they crossed into Germany, but Red was telling me stories of how he landed in France in July, coming up off the beaches, seeing all the crosses for the soldiers, temporary graves for the men and boys who were killed, seeing the German language still announcing that there were mines in the area. Achtung, pay attention, there's mines here. And then fighting through the Battle of France, the Battle of Normandy. Really crazy stories about going really fast in these tanks, supporting the infantry, because that was his job. And these two guys were in the same tank. Red was a bow gunner. He said that was the lowest form of life. These are the guys who shot the machine guns in the front of the tank. And I forget what George was. He might have been a loader. So the 5 guys in one of these light tanks, and they're moving fast. And sometimes they have to sleep in the tanks. And these two guys didn't get along at all. They fought like cat and dog. George Gross is very by the book, very military, came from a military background family. He lived in San Diego, I don't know if I mentioned that. But Red Walsh, he wanted nothing to do with the Army. He was a lawyer. He just graduated from Providence Law School. He was 24, 25. So he was the antagonist the whole time. He did his job because he had to do it. And he was good at it. So by the time April 13th, 1945 rolls around, which is what the story is about, they both have command of their own tanks, separate tanks. And on April 13th, 1945, they're in a column, about 20 light tanks in D Company of the 743rd Tank Battalion, and their major comes up to them and says, "You two, follow me." The major was Major Clarence Benjamin from Oakland, California. He said, "We have to go check out this train that stopped at this railroad siding near the Elbe River. We don't understand what it's doing here. It's about 40 or 50 boxcars and passenger cars crammed in together, but it's just stalled out and there's people milling around here. We gotta check this out, okay? You have to remember that it's mid-April. World War II in Europe is gonna end in 3 weeks, but they still have a major battle to fight at the city of Magdeburg on the Elbe River, hence the title of the book, A Train Near Magdeburg. So you can read it. It says, to the benefit of whoever's watching now, 2 American tanks led by a major in a Jeep came to investigate a strange train transport stop near the tracks near the Elbe River. The major stopped the Jeep and snapped this photo as desperate people swarmed up the hill and tanks and American troops erupted. So I'm talking to Red Walsh in his daughter's living room. For 2 hours he's telling me combat stories, funny stories about how he was a fugitive from the law of averages. He should be dead after 10 months of combat. And then, just about when I was ready to turn the camera off, he said to his daughter said, chimed up. She was watching in the background. She said, "Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train?" He said, "No, I didn't think about that." And he started telling. And this was literally 3 or 4 minutes of a 2-hour conversation. And he said what I just told you. Major Benjamin said, "You 2 tanks, tank 12 and tank 13, we have to go see what's going on here." So they pulled up right behind the major's Jeep. The major stood up, took this picture. And if you look at the little girl, okay, look at her face. Look at the faces of the other people. They know what's going on, right? They know that they're free. She's terrified. And the way she's looking, I know. What she's terrified is these monster tanks are starting to clank up behind the Jeep. She's freaked out. Anyway. So, next thing. So he's telling me the story, and he said, "You want to talk to George Gross in California, retired English literature professor from San Diego State University, because he had a camera and he took his own pictures that day. He took 10 or 11 photographs. There's 9 of them here, right?" And I contacted Dr. Gross in California through email, and he wrote these beautiful, beautiful email letters. And he wrote this beautiful narrative that's in the book about what happened. His tank was assigned, and that's his tank in the lower corner with the gun sticking out. And the girl at the bottom panel is in front of his tank. His tank was assigned to stay overnight, whereas Walsh's tank, he left like within the hour. his whole thing was, this is 1 hour out of the war for me. That's why I didn't bring it up. But Gross is there overnight, and he had some major things to say about it. This girl at the bottom of the front of the tank, we actually connected him with her again 56 years later, living in Israel. Her name was Gina Rappaport. But these are all the people that were saved. Okay, so back to my part, how I fit into this story. I asked those two gentlemen for permission to put their stories up on my school website, Hunter Falls website, which about 2 people would go to a year. But we had a World War II Living History project. And my whole point was, okay, we're collecting these stories, interviews, whatever, not doing anybody any good if we keep it to ourselves. So we put it on the internet. He gave me permission to put the photographs up. It's a beautiful narrative. And I got an email. I was literally sitting in my classroom in March of 2006, given a test. You know, I turned my back to the kids for a minute, checked my email, and boom, this is the email of my inbox. And her name is Lexi Keston. She's the grandmother who was a 7-year-old girl on the train. And she saw the photographs on the school website. I'll never forget that when I opened the website, before my unbelieving eyes, I was looking back to 1945, the day of my liberation by the U.S. 9th Army. Now, she did not remember a lot of the particulars. She was a young girl. But a lot of these survivors, almost like what you see here in the picture. And I've talked to a few who were children on this train. Everything about the Holocaust in their memory is black and white. But the day of liberation after that was almost like the Wizard of Oz. Everything was in color again in their minds. Kind of an interesting phenomenon. Anyway, I got pretty emotional on my computer. I should have teared. But I hooked her up with Dr. Gross and Red Walsh. Families are very close together now. Lexi's very close to Red's daughter, etc. Both Red and Dr. Gross are gone now, unfortunately. But while I had the opportunity, I heard from a few other survivors. It's kind of, that's the way the universe worked. About a month after Lexi contacted me, I heard from Fred Spiegel, retired LL Israeli airline executive, New Jersey. Dr. Peter Lamtos, a brain doctor in London at King's College, and Dr. Mika Tomkowitz, a physicist at Brooklyn University. These people were known dogs, which always brings me back to, they were 4 or 5 years old at the time of their liberation. But it always brings me back to, what did we lose in the Holocaust? We can't even imagine it. I said, come on up to Hudson Falls High School, September 14th, 2007. I'm going to introduce you to your Liberator. So they came up. Lantos flew over, hooked up with Mika. They drove up. Fred drove himself up. Fred came back to high school many times to talk to the kids. And look at Walsh's face. He loved it. He's eating it up. He was so funny. Anyway, that was Friday, September 14th, 2007. And it was all done in front of the students. They heard all these eyewitness testimony accounts. The next day I went to Staples. It was pouring out. I went to Glens Falls, Staples there. I was looking for a new computer, and the salesman, of course, is trying to, rack up the card that I use. So he said, hey, you need a monitor to go with this. So he fires up the monitor and turns it on, and this is what popped up. This is the screen. And I said, oh my gosh, that's my classroom. That's Red Walsh. Now, the backstory of that is I had a friend in the Associated Press. I did a lot of archaeology with Dr. David Starbuck, you may be familiar with if you're follow the history locally. French and Indian War, archaeology, American Revolution, and this reporter from the Associated Press out of Albany, his name's Chris Carolla. He would come up every year, so I got to be friends with Chris. So I got a hold of Chris and said, Chris, do you think anybody would be interested in this story? He came up and he said, yes, for sure. So he came up the day before, and he said to me, he said, Matt, you better tell the secretaries here and your teachers that I think this story's going to get picked up. AP, right? It's going to go everywhere, and it did. And Saturday morning, it was the lead story on Yahoo, when Yahoo was a thing. Anyway, that was in 2007. So, in the past X amount of years since then, I wrote a book, but I heard from more than 275 survivors and a lot more soldiers. We hosted 2 more reunions at the high school besides that one. We did 11 reunions overall on 3 continents. We had one in Israel. And I wrote the book, which is kind of blown up now because people want to learn about the Holocaust. And we have a documentary that's probably going to be out, I hope, in spring 2022. It was supposed to be out earlier, but the pandemic obviously set everything back. Okay, so I'm writing this book. I have some questions. And these are questions that young people should ask themselves and adults too. Because they're important questions. How many people were murdered in the Holocaust? Well, if you're an educator, you might know the number, 6 million, right? Pretty standard. Okay, so that's the Jewish population. But how do you define Holocaust? That's a whole other thing. But what does 6 million look like? Can you picture 6 million of anything in your mind? How many camps were there, right? Who's responsible for the biggest crime in the history of the world? Just how did that happen? Was it Adolf Hitler alone? I think we know the answer to that question. How many Jewish people did Hitler kill? The answer is, with his own hands? No. He hasn't done. How were the people freed on the train? A snapshot of European Jewry persecuted by the Nazis and others. In other words, if I'm going to write this book, what's this train thing all about? Okay, most of them were Hungarian Jews, but there were Jews from the Netherlands, people who knew Ian Frank, because that's where Ian Frank grew up, right? German Jews, Polish Jews, there were even Greek Jews on this train. How'd they wind up in Bergen-Belsen? Can I make people care today about what happened nearly 3 generations ago? Well, that's every teacher's challenge, right? Why is it important to listen to those who were the first witnesses? What happens when these stories are no longer with us? And once people have absorbed the stories, do they have a moral responsibility to act on the quote-unquote lessons? What are the lessons, first and foremost? And then what are you going to do about it in your life? Okay? Is there such thing as being a witness when you yourself were not there? Elie Wiesel says yes, unequivocally. Anyway, this article came out in the New York Times, I think about, probably says here, 2013, right? The Holocaust just got more shocking. Well, how could that happen? How many camps and ghettos were there? How's this number? Almost 43,000, okay? Now this is dated information. This is a New York Times article from, one of the reporters actually studied at the Holocaust Museum for months, and he was on the inside taking this. 43,000, just got more shocking. The figure is so staggering that even fellow Holocaust scholars had to make sure they had heard it correctly. So much higher than what we originally thought. Documented camps include not only killing centers, but thousands of forced labor camps, prison war camps, euphemistically named care centers where pregnant women were forced to have abortions or the babies were killed after birth, etc. Okay? I'm going to take you now to Bergen-Belsen. And you probably are having some questions in your mind. Maybe I can answer some of them when I'm done. Because that's the whole point of studying the Holocaust. The thing is you learn, as I have, just when you think you know everything, you realize you know nothing. And you can say that about a lot of events in history when you start getting into the deep dive. But the Holocaust is a whole other thing. Okay, so this is where those people were, a place called Bergen-Belsen, which you may have heard of. It's in northwest Germany. I circled it here on the map in green. You can see the dots represent concentration camps in this book. It's from the Time and Life World War II series from the mid-1980s. I had my students count it one time. There's like 300 dots on here, and the bigger ones are where the bigger camps were. When you get to Poland, you have the really big ones because this is where the killing centers were. Don't forget, out of those 6 million people, over 3 million European Jews lived in Poland. And there's a reason for that, which I don't have time to get into right now, but this is why these were the quote-unquote extermination centers, right? Auschwitz being one of them, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I hate the word extermination because these people weren't bugs. They were murdered in industrial murder factories. Bergen-Belsen was not one of those camps, though. It started out as a Soviet POW camp. Don't forget, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 to great success. And it had a lot of incarnations, and one of the most horrible ones, besides being a concentration camp for victims of the regime, it was the Soviet prisoner of war camp. And this map is from April 1945, and you can see what's going on. You see the Allies pushing from the west and the Soviets pushing from the east. So things are getting pretty tight here. And this is literally 3 days after the British walked into Bergen-Belsen. Well, a week before that, 3 train transports full of concentration camp prisoners left Bergen-Belsen, about 7,000 people, 6,700. On many of these trains, there were families, intact families, and on the train that I'm talking about, the train near Magdeburg, that was liberated by the Americans on April 13th, out of the 3 trains, there were like 500 kids on that train. That's why I can find 275 people who are alive today who were on that train, because they were only 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 into their teens years old when the Americans saved them. It was liberated, the camp, on April 15th. By that time, these 3 transports had left about a week before, and this is what the British saw. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphic pictures. There were 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died, okay? There were 60,000 people when the British 11th Armored Division went through the gates of Bergen-Belsen. 60,000. Why? Because you remember the chaos that's going on here in Germany. These camps are being overrun. The Germans are forcing these prisoners into these death marches to try and get as far away as possible from the advancing Allies. And they wound up at Bergen-Belsen. One of the first memorials appeared in the 1960s. I took these pictures on our trip in 2013. Those are the teachers I went with for 3 weeks. And this is our first concentration camp. It was so appropriate for me and my studies in Bergen-Belsen. A model of the camp, a German historian, fellow teachers. Huge camp. Well, what do you do with 60,000 people? Okay? 800 of them died the day the British arrived. And they continued to die, as you read in that poster board that the British erupted. But it became a displaced persons camp. What do you do with all these people? And that's the question. Is the United States going to take them? Is Canada going to take them? Not right away, okay? I have friends who are on this train near Magdeburg who got out of Bergen-Belsen and wound up back in Bergen-Belsen for 5 more years. And these are the grave sites of people who died during that time. You're not going to find individual graves for the people who died in the camp. And the camp is very beautiful today. It's pristine, it's like a park. And here are the 2 tour leaders, and this is a new structure. Kind of stark, but it should be. But it's like a park outside. You have to use your imagination. Or you can look at the 1945 photographs. This is our teacher group wandering through Bergen-Belsen. And here's a 1945 photograph taken 2 or 3 weeks after liberation. And I don't do all of these pictures, but this is what those 4 British soldiers walked into. Can you imagine being 19 or 20 and walking into that? This was the women's barracks in May 1945. Here they are. A nice little paved roadway. Same spot, 1945. Those are dead bodies. It's a pretty well-known picture, by the way. Horrible pictures. And in the classroom, I don't use these lightly. If I have fellow teachers in here, you got to be pretty judicious with what we do. This is me walking through the woods. You see gutter channel. There it is. It's a latrine going off the latrines. There it is in 1945, and this man expired just about the time this photograph was taken, right after liberation. What they died of? Well, you can imagine. Does everybody know who she is? We know her, right? That's Margot. That's her older sister. And this is Anne. And I was reading, I don't even know how I got the article, in the Toronto Star, big newspaper up there. I forget what the article was about. I think Justin Bieber visited the Anne Frank house. They showed you a photograph of. And he wrote in the guidebook, or the, sign the book thing, he wrote, Anne would have been a believer if she was alive. And of course the newspaper was taking him to task, and the newspaper stated she died in Auschwitz in 1945. So I wrote the person and I said, look, she didn't die in Auschwitz. She was shipped to Auschwitz from the Netherlands after she was betrayed. Her mother, her sister, I think her father too. But they wound up in Bergen-Belsen in November of 1944. A trainload of women from Auschwitz were then shipped to Bergen-Belsen. And again, you have to remember the logistics. The Soviets are closing in. These women, maybe they can work. She's a teenager, right? They get there in November of 1944. They have nowhere to put these women. So they erect this huge tent, canopy tent. Well, what happens in northwest Germany in late November of 1944? Winter storms, it knocked the tent down. Somehow these girls survived until the following spring. I know people who were on the train who were friends with them in the Netherlands. And they talk about Anne and Margot coming to the fence, trying to talk to their friends who are on other transports who somehow all wound up in this Bergen-Belsen. And Anne wasn't coming to the fence anymore because they were separated somehow by a fence, a barbed wire fence. And this one survivor in particular remembers throwing bread through the fence to Margot, and then Margot didn't show up. They died of typhus in February or March of 1945, about 5, maybe 4 weeks before the British came through the camp. So I told the reporter that, and she corrected the story, and I said, hey, by the way, I know people in Toronto who knew her, who were on the Train Near Magdeburg. And the reporter, to her credit, got a hold of them and did some beautiful stories on them. Anyway, here's a marker for Margot and Ian, and I guarantee you that is not where they are buried. This is where they're buried. In one of these monoliths, these mass graves. Here lies 800 dead. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this picture, but anytime you see a photograph of a British soldier in a bulldozer with a bandana over his face, pushing corpses into a big trench, it's Bergen-Belsen. Here lies 1,000 dead. There's dozens of these all over. This place is a mass cemetery. And that's where Ian and Margot are. Danger, typhus. This will kill the girls. They got sick. This is lice, a lice-borne disease. Fever, diarrhea, danger, typhus. That means drive slow, because if you kick the dust up, you're going to kick up this virus. And this man, Urban Abadi, was a survivor from Hungary. He was liberated on the Train Near Magdeburg. He drew and he painted feverishly after liberation, hundreds of paintings. And this is one of his an American men trying to combat the outbreak of typhus. This is a typhus picture right here. You could recover from it. Some of my survivor friends did. But on May 15th, about a month after liberation, the British burnt the camp to the ground. And I remember some of the teachers who were in our group, you know, it was a pretty emotional trip. They were crying because it was such a peaceful, beautiful place, a scene of such horror, such tragedy. This is where Ian died. This is what it looks like today. There are no barracks to remember about. Okay, so I told you about that survivor who contacted me. It's because of this guy. His name is Bergen-Belsen. He's a German historian. His job is, he's called the keeper of the Book of Names. They're trying to reconstruct the name of every single person, 120,000 people who went through the gates of Bergen-Belsen. Many of them did survive. Obviously, many of them didn't, right? But they don't know all the names because the Germans, the SS, destroyed the records. So his job is to reconstruct these books. And he and one of his colleagues were the ones who found my school, Hudson Falls High School website with these pictures on it that they had never seen before. They knew about the train. Nobody had ever seen these pictures before, so they made their own exhibit, right? Which is cool. Anyway, he went to Australia and he gave a lecture, and afterwards Lexi came up to him and said, "Do you know anything about the train?" And of course he knew everything about it, and that's how it happened. This map shows Belsen, and this is actually the site of Theresienstadt, the camp where they were destined to in Czechoslovakia. That's the small blue dot is where the Americans liberated it. This map's from the Bergen-Belsen Memorial. The yellow indicates the train that was liberated by the Americans. The others, there were two other trains. One of them actually did make it down to Czechoslovakia. The first one liberated, the people who were lucky were on the one I'm telling you about tonight. It was Friday the 13th, by the way. The second train, a week later, made it to Theresienstadt. I'm not sure what happened to those people, but this is the very last German concentration camp liberated in World War II. It was liberated on the last day of the war, May 8th, by the Russians. And of course, the third train was one liberated by the Russians across the Elbe River about 2 weeks after the first train. Here's the photograph that Major Benjamin shot, and it went into his after-action report, and it disappeared into the National Archives until Dr. Gross showed it to me. And it tells what their experience was. So, I got to speed this up a little bit. I mean, I could talk all night about it. reporter reported his story in 2007, and I told you it went everywhere. It went viral before viral was an internet thing. It was in newspapers in Israel, it was in Canada, it was all over the world. So, that was a Saturday. By Sunday, the school servers shut down because so many people were going to the Hudson Falls Central School District website. I broke the internet. And I heard, by the time Monday morning rolled around, I heard from 60 more children who had been on that train. 60. So Chris did a good thing to report. I also heard from Frank Towers. Frank Towers was 30th Infantry Division Lieutenant, and his job between the 743rd Tank Battalion, of which Red was in Tank 12, Gross was in Tank 13, on the 13th of April, Friday the 13th, Frank Towers was the guy who had to get these people out of harm's way, because these tanks were headed to the battle. So Frank showed up Saturday morning, he transported them all to an abandoned German Air Force base called Hillersleben, and that's where Frank left. Anyway, I got these two together. It was beautiful. We had the reunion in Hudson Falls. Other survivors came down. And Redwood wrote this letter to Steve, because Steve was always sending letters saying, thank God you were there. I love you. You're my liberator. And Walt should write back and say, I'm not your liberator. I was just there. I was just following orders. In other words, what he was trying to impress upon Steve Berry, the survivor, was, we don't owe you anything. Excuse me. You don't owe us anything. We owe you, and that's what he writes in this letter. Gratitude is not deserved. I don't believe gratitude is deserved because we were just doing what we were told to do. You don't owe us, we owe you. We can never repay you and the Jewish people of Europe for what was stolen from you, your homes, your possessions, your businesses, your money, your art, your family life, your families, your childhood, your dreams. And this letter is now in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The director herself asked for it, and they both gave permission. That's Frank Towers, who I just mentioned, and Ariela Rojek, my Polish grandmother in Toronto. She's still with us. She was 13 when she was liberated. Love her. This is Frank in Jerusalem, meeting these two sisters. Look at the expressions on their faces, right? We're children on the train. Leslie Meisel's of Toronto, holding his granddaughter. There's 17-year-old Leslie in the corner. He calls his granddaughter. She's a very precocious thing. She's pounding on the piano keys when I was trying to talk to Leslie. His revenge. Great man. And Lily Cohen, she got a hold of me. She was 4 years old. She was an orphan. She was raised by women in the women's barracks. She didn't remember much. She was a young girl, right? But she does remember the women cutting all of her hair off to get the lights on. She wound up becoming a very well-known Israeli dancer, and this is actually on the steamboat in Lake George, and I visited her in Tel Aviv. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up now. I know I've been going for a while, but that's what happens. So after our last reunion at the high school, we went to Israel in May 2011, and we did the following fall, the final reunion at the high school. You have to remember, these people are in their 80s, sometimes in 90s, and you're asking them to travel from all over the world. So we knew it was it. So after the last reunion in September of 2011, I'm sitting in my classroom thinking, wow, that was great. What a great experience. Too bad it's over, right? And the phone rang in my classroom. Now, here's the thing. The school district, Hudson Falls, God bless them, they actually put an outside line in my classroom. This is before every teacher had a cell phone. It's before. Teachers don't have outside lines to call anywhere in the world, their classrooms. But the secretaries were getting bombarded with these phone calls for years. So they put an outside line. They were good to me. So the phone rang. And it was this guy. And he said, Matt Rozell, God bless you. I've been looking for people related to this story for years. And we went down to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he was. He was a combat medic. Okay, so I told you the soldiers left. And in fact, Walsh was only there for an hour. They liberated the train. But they had to go. And this guy had to take care of these people for 6 weeks. And he told me stories, and it's all in the book, about how he became attached to these teenagers who were sick, trying to heal them. And one 15-year-old girl died in his arms. And he remembers her name. And he carried her down the stairs to the morgue tent. They had a morgue tent set up outside. It was June and the May. And it just stuck with him all these years. So when he got home, who do you tell about these experiences? You going to talk to your parents about it? He didn't. He kept it all out. But he was, he became very active in his community. He was a coach. He was a basketball coach. Everyone loved him. Anyway. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. Maybe not. But he was a guest of the president for his State of the Union address in 2019, in February. And the reason he was a guest was because he was a survivor 2 times over. Remember the horrific Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh massacre that occurred, in which 12 or 13 human beings were murdered in their own house of worship. Judah was pulling into the parking lot, and he was 5 minutes late, and he saw the gunman come out. And he said, I could tell by the way he was moving, he was firing in clips of 5 as he was coming out, and then the SWAT teams took him down. But he was a former Israeli paratrooper, a military guy himself, so he kind of recognized what was going on, so he didn't get out of the car. And then later, the Washington Post did an article, a lot of news sources did, but they did a deep dive on his history. And of course, everybody was, I don't want to say excited, that's not the right word, but he was a Holocaust survivor who survived the shooting. So he's telling this story about being a boy, and about being in the woods, and the train stops, and his father says, those are American tanks, look at the star in the tank. And the soldier popped up out of the turret, and he said, you guys are free. I said, wait a minute. This guy was on the train. And it turns out he was. So I did a deep dive. I'm pretty good at this now. I tracked down his daughter, who lived in Philadelphia, and she agreed to bring him up to Scranton, Pennsylvania to meet Walter for the first time since 1945. Walter had contact with a lot of these people. So we do have a film. We filmed it all, and here's a trailer clip. I'm just going to narrate for you because it sounds not great. Kind of emotional. Walter Gans was a World War II soldier who helped rescue 2,500 Jewish prisoners. A long time ago. It's a lifetime. He's waiting to meet Judah. stopped in the middle of the forest. Everybody panicked. They come to kill us all. The turret opens. The soldier pops out. My father yelled America. I did another talk in New Jersey a week later, and he came to it, and there was a survivor from Brooklyn who came, and it was pretty emotional. That was great. And he died the following November. He's in the book. He said he read the book 5 or 6 times. He says, Matt, I can't stop reading it. I said, why? He said, it's not because I'm in it, because he's chapter 14 or something, the medic. He said, because I never knew this history before. And that's where I wrote the book for. I wrote it for the survivors and their families. I wrote it for the Liberators and their families. And obviously I wrote it for my students and anybody who's interested in the Holocaust, because everybody can learn something. If you think you're an expert, you can learn more. Because I'm not an expert. And boy, I had some revelations when I was writing that book. And I'm not trying to push or sell the book. They are outside. If you want one tonight, enjoy it. But his family put the book in Walter's coffin. And they buried him. So I do get kind of emotional. And almost every person, with the exception of Ariella, my Polish grandmother in Toronto, who was in this story that I'm telling you tonight, is gone. It was a flash. And they're gone. But their stories aren't going to die. So this is the book here. My first book was on the Pacific War. And these stories we collected. The air war over Europe, the war in Italy, D-Day and beyond, Battle of the Bulge. This is the new one coming out across the Rhine River. Spent a few hours this morning working on it. I better get it done soon. The deadline. But this is the book that touches me the most. And it was almost like an accident. But it wasn't an accident, because things don't happen that way. Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train? He almost didn't tell me the story. Nobody would know this story. And there's literally thousands of people in the world today who've been changed by this story. It's an amazing thing. And if you're a teacher or a former educator, you know what I'm talking about. You go your entire life wondering if you made a difference. I got lucky. Because sometimes you don't find out. But y'all do. Anyway, that's my story. If you do have a question, I can answer it. I know I gotta keep it short. Okay, all the answers are in my book. They're for sale outside.
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce quickly Kyle West of Fort Salem Theater. And here in the jury box, you're probably seeing these people up front, the cast of The Diary of Anne Frank. So I'm going to have Kyle present them to you.
Hello, thank you so much. As Judy mentioned, my name is Kyle West with Fort Salem Theater. To my left and your right is the cast and the creative team of The Diary of Anne Frank. And on behalf of everyone at Fort Salem Theater, we'd just like to say thank you all so much for letting us be part of this conversation, and we look forward to continuing this as we present The Diary of Anne Frank. Not this weekend, but next weekend, October 8th, 9th, and 10th, over at the theater. We do still have tickets available if you're interested in joining us, and you can choose your seats at fortsalem.com. But thank you all so much, and thank you again for welcoming us. Thank you.
So Matthew will be downstairs in the Great Hall signing books if some of you would like to learn more about these stories tonight. Thank you all for coming.